What if the most dangerous move you could make in 2026 isn't taking a risk, but doing absolutely nothing? Because the truth that almost nobody wants to hear is that the money you think is protecting you right now might actually be the thing slowly destroying you. And that sounds dramatic, but stay with me, because once you see what's really happening under the surface, you'll never look at playing it safe the same way again. Most people think wealth disappears because of bad investments, market crashes, or terrible timing, but that's not how it usually happens. It disappears quietly. It disappears while you're sleeping. It disappears while your bank balance looks exactly the same as it did yesterday. And that's the part that makes it so dangerous. Because when nothing looks broken, you assume nothing is wrong, and by the time you realize the damage is real, it's already been done. Right now, millions of people believe they're being smart by holding cash. They tell themselves they're cautious, disciplined, responsible. They say they're waiting for the market to calm down, waiting for the next crash, waiting for the perfect moment. But here's the problem. While they're waiting, the rules of the game are changing, and the game doesn't reward patience the way it used to. In fact, in this environment, patience with cash is punished. That's why the warning matters so much right now, because we're not heading into a normal financial cycle. We're heading into a period where the people who feel the safest will actually be the most exposed. And the ones who understand that shift early will protect their portfolios while everyone else is wondering what went wrong. The biggest illusion in modern finance is that cash is neutral, that it just sits there untouched, unchanged, waiting for you to decide what to do. But cash is not neutral anymore. It's active. It's actively losing power every single day. And the scariest part is that loss doesn't show up as a red number. It shows up as a future you can't afford anymore. Think about it this way. If you had $100,000 sitting in an account and inflation was running at 5 or 6%, that money wouldn't feel like it's shrinking. The number wouldn't move. But what that money can buy absolutely would. The groceries, the gas, the rent, the health care, the insurance, all of it creeps higher while your balance pretends nothing is happening. And that gap between the number you see and the life you can actually live is where wealth quietly evaporates. That's why calling cash safe is such a dangerous misunderstanding. Safe compared to what? Safe from volatility? Maybe, but not safe from erosion. Not safe from dilution. Not safe from the reality that central banks have flooded the system with more money than at any point in history. And when you flood the system, the value of each individual dollar has to go somewhere, and it doesn't go up. This is basic economics, but it hits differently when you realize you're on the wrong side of it. More supply, same demand, lower value. That's not an opinion. That's a rule, and no amount of discipline or restraint can override it. You can't outsave monetary policy. You can't outweight inflation. You can only position yourself so it hurts you less. Here's where most people get defensive. They say, but I need liquidity. And they're right. Liquidity matters. You need flexibility. You need breathing room. You need to be able to handle emergencies without panic. But there's a massive difference between strategic liquidity and hoarding cash out of fear. One is intentional. The other is paralysis dressed up as responsibility. Strategic liquidity is knowing exactly why that money exists and what job it's supposed to do. It's there to protect you from disruption, not to replace your entire financial strategy. 3 months of expenses, maybe 6, enough to sleep at night. Beyond that, every extra dollar sitting idle is a dollar refusing to work for you. And in this environment, refusing to work means falling behind. And here's the part most people don't want to admit. The truly wealthy don't think of cash as wealth. They think of it as a temporary state, a tool, a bridge between decisions. They don't measure success by how much cash they have sitting around. They measure it by how much cash their assets generate without them lifting a finger. That's the fundamental shift in mindset that separates people who preserve wealth from people who slowly lose it. Assets versus idle money, income versus balance, motion versus stagnation, because money that moves into productive assets can defend itself. Money that stays still cannot. The scary part is that the current environment doesn't just fail to reward cash. It actively punishes it. Central banks don't need your permission to dilute your purchasing power. Governments don't need your consent to run deficits. And you don't get a vote on how fast prices rise relative to your savings. All of that happens, whether you like it or not, The only thing you control is where your money sits while it's happening, and that's why doing nothing has quietly become the riskiest strategy of all. Now, here's where the conversation shifts, because once you accept that cash isn't protecting you, the next question becomes uncomfortable. If cash is losing, where do you go instead? Because it's one thing to say, don't do this, and another to actually replace it with something that works. This is where most advice falls apart. People throw out vague ideas. Invest more. Diversify. Think long term. That all sounds nice, but it doesn't change behavior because it doesn't feel real. What actually changes behavior is understanding cause and effect. Understanding why certain assets survive inflation while others get crushed, and understanding how income changes the entire equation. Income is the missing piece most people overlook. Not appreciation, not speculation, income. Because when assets produce cash flow, they give you options. They reduce pressure, they create resilience, and they turn inflation from a threat into something you can partially outrun. That's why dividend-paying businesses matter so much in environments like this. Not because they're exciting, but because they're relentless. They pay you whether the market is euphoric or terrified. They deposit money into your account while headlines scream about uncertainty. And that income, reinvested over time, compounds in a way idle cash never will. But here's the trap people fall into. They think dividends mean risk. They imagine wild swings, unstable companies, speculative bets. In reality, the strongest dividend payers tend to be boring on purpose. Utilities, consumer staples, healthcare, financial services. Companies that sell things people need regardless of the economy. Companies that have survived wars, recessions, pandemics, and political chaos and still manage to raise payouts year after year. That's not luck, that's durability. And durability is what inflation struggles to destroy. When prices rise, strong businesses adjust, they raise prices, they protect margins, they pass costs along, and when they do, the cash they generate rises too. That's why income-producing assets have a fighting chance in an inflationary environment. They can adapt. Cash can't, and that's just one pillar. The next pillar most people ignore until it's too late is fixed income. Bonds get dismissed as boring, outdated, irrelevant. But boring is exactly what you want when uncertainty spikes, especially when yields actually compensate you for your time. After years of artificially low rates, the landscape has changed. Bonds are no longer symbolic, they're functional again. When you can lock in yields that rival or exceed inflation expectations, something interesting happens. You stop bleeding purchasing power, you create predictability, you introduce structure into a system that feels chaotic, and predictability is incredibly underrated. Knowing when you'll get your principal back, knowing what income to expect, knowing how different maturities interact with changing rates, that's not weakness, that's control. Control matters because it prevents emotional decisions, it keeps you from panicking at the wrong moment, and it creates a rhythm where money is constantly being redeployed instead of sitting frozen in fear. Then there's the asset class that people love to argue about but secretly wish they owned more of: real estate. Not because it's glamorous, but because it's stubborn. It exists in the physical world. It provides shelter, storage, workspace, and those needs don't disappear just because markets wobble. When supply is limited and demand keeps growing, prices don't need hype to rise. They rise because people have no alternative. And rents don't stay flat when costs increase. They adjust slowly, steadily, relentlessly. That's why real estate has been one of the most effective inflation hedges in human history. Not because it's perfect, but because it's real. And even if owning property directly isn't feasible, exposure through income-producing structures gives you a seat at the table without the operational burden. At this point, some people start getting nervous. They imagine everything going wrong at once. Stocks falling, bonds shifting, property values correcting, and that fear feels logical until you realize it's built on a false assumption, that diversification means choosing one thing and hoping it works. Real diversification is the opposite. It's accepting that different assets behave differently under pressure and letting them balance each other out. When one stumbles, another stabilizes. When volatility spikes, income cushions. When rates change, maturities roll. That's how portfolios survive storms without needing heroic timing. And timing is the illusion that traps people in cash the longest. The belief that if they just wait a little longer, clarity will appear. But clarity rarely arrives before opportunity disappears. Markets don't ring bells at the bottom. They move quietly, then suddenly, and by the time confidence returns, prices have already adjusted. That's why waiting for the perfect moment often guarantees missing it. There's a story that perfectly captures this mistake. An investor sitting on millions in cash convinced discipline meant waiting for disaster. Year after year, markets rose, corrected, rose again. Every rally felt like a trap. Every dip felt insufficient. And while he waited, inflation did its work. Slowly at first, then all at once. By the time he looked back, the damage wasn't theoretical. It was real. The same money bought less life, less security, less freedom, and the irony was painful. By trying to avoid loss, he guaranteed it. That's the paradox most people never resolve. Safety isn't about avoiding movement. It's about choosing the right kind of movement. And in a world where money loses value by default, standing still is not neutral. It's active decay. This is where the story really starts to matter. Because understanding the problem is only half of it. The harder part is deciding what to do next, especially when uncertainty feels louder than opportunity. And that decision doesn't begin with a massive leap. It begins with a shift in identity. You stop seeing yourself as someone who waits for certainty and start seeing yourself as someone who builds resilience, someone who accepts uncertainty as the price of growth, not a signal to freeze, someone who understands that the future rewards participation, not perfection. And once that shift happens, the question changes from what if I'm wrong to what happens if I do nothing? Because doing nothing is no longer free. And here's the part almost nobody talks about. The longer you wait, the harder it becomes to act. Inflation compounds, opportunity cost compounds, regret compounds, and suddenly the move that once felt simple feels overwhelming. That's why action matters now, not later. Not because everything is clear, but because clarity follows commitment, not the other way around. But even knowing that, there's still one final psychological barrier most people haven't confronted yet. The fear that the moment they act, something bad will happen, that they'll invest and the market will drop, that they'll move out of cash and regret it immediately. And that fear feels real until you realize it's not about the market at all, it's about control. Cash feels like control because it doesn't move, but real control comes from systems that function regardless of noise. And that's where this conversation is going next, because understanding how to deploy capital gradually, intentionally, without betting everything on one moment is the difference between confidence and panic. That's the part most people never learn.